Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As we prepare for calves' arrival on dairy farms this spring, dairy specialist George Ramsbottom reminds us of best practice in calf rearing to promote health and performance in early life.
In colostrum collection, Emma-Louise, best practice is, fairly quick removal of colostrum into a clean container from a clean cow after she calves. And the reason for that is because we know there's a rapid decline in immunoglobulin content in cow's milk after the calf is born. The immunoglobulins are the antibodies effectively that protect the calf after it's born. So quick removal, then the calf is fed the equivalent of around 8.5% of its birth weight. So that's typically 3 litres of fluid of the colostrum, that first milking, as soon as it's born. And that gives us its best chance to achieve a high level of immunity called passive immunity after it's born. And it'll prevent it or help prevent it from acquiring a lot or becoming ill with a lot of diseases that are typically prevalent in calf houses in early spring.
And you mentioned passive transfer or active passive transfer. From measurement or evidence on farms, is the colostrum feeding successful?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, in terms of how we evidence to show that if calves are properly administered the correct volume of colostrum, that it does improve both health and immune levels. And absolutely, the evidence is there. We do zinc sulfate tests to look at the antibody content of calf blood. And we know from the evidence from the district veterinary offices that when they do PMs on calves, that typically calves that die have less immunoglobulins or have low level of antibodies to protect them after they're born. So feeding the correct quantity of colostrum works really, really well at preventing infections in calves. It can be assessed then using a Brix refractometer, and we're looking there for a target of 50 grams of immunoglobulin per litre of colostrum. So there's a kind of a level there that you're looking for. And most cows will calve down with that level unless they're being poorly fed in the last couple of weeks prior to calving. So feeding the cow reasonably well, good quality silage or whatever, prior to calving will help to boost immunoglobulin levels and pass the best quality colostrum onto the newborn calf.
And then when we look to the feeding of colostrum, in a lot of scenarios, a cow calves, say for example, in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day, outside of milking times, they're going to be fed colostrum that's not necessarily directly from the dam. So if we think about fresh colostrum product or frozen, if we start with fresh, what are your tips in terms of management of that colostrum?
Okay, so tip number 1 is cool it as quickly as possible. So it's put in a container and put in the fridge at 4 degrees or less than 4 degrees Celsius. In that situation, our analysis shows that it can remain, very high quality for up to 48 hours. So that's the first thing. If it's left in a bucket in the corner and fed to the calves as they're born, very quickly it'll deteriorate, particularly as the weather warms up in March and April. So the quicker it's chilled, the quicker it's chilled, the better, and it can be stored for 48 hours. That's the first point. The second point then is when we're talking about frozen colostrum, that needs to be thawed slowly if it's being used to feed the calf. And what I mean by that is it's thawed at a temperature of less than 50 degrees Celsius. If it's thawed at a much higher temperature, and typically people would throw it into a bucket and put boiling water in on top of the flask or container that has the colostrum. In that scenario, it'll lose a lot of its immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins are proteins. They're very same as the albumin in an egg is. And you know well that when you put an egg into boiling water to poach it, it'll go hard, or the immunoglobulins or the proteins that it contains will be denatured. And if the colostrum is thawed at too high a temperature, it'll lose its ability to protect the calf. The immunoglobulin quality is deteriorated very quickly. So thaw it slowly at 50 degrees if you're going to freeze it.
And should colostrum be fed at a warm, heated temperature, or is cold colostrum okay?
Well, let's put it this way. Cold colostrum is better than nothing. In an ideal world, the best method of transferring the correct quantity of immunoglobulins is to feed a warm colostrum but get the calves to suck it. That's the ideal scenario. Sucking will actually increase the absorption of the antibodies as well. So in an ideal world, we're talking about a calf being allowed to teat feed, a teat feed and a bottle we're talking about, to make sure we get the correct quantity in. The next best scenario is warm colostrum stomach tubed. The next best scenario is stomach tubing of cold colostrum. So better warm and better teat fed. They're the kind of things we talk about.
And the teat fed is interesting, George, because in a lot of scenarios, we have seen increased herd size, and a lot of people are choosing to stomach tube as a method of ensuring that they get it in, and they're getting it in at a faster pace. But as you say, best practice, you are looking at teat feeding.
In an ideal world, look, where there's large numbers involved in this time constraints, better to stomach tube than to take a chance on the calf acquiring enough colostrum itself or ingesting enough, because in reality we know that where calves are left to their own devices, they don't generally consume enough to give them good protection naturally from the cow. So feeding the calf is the much preferred option, either by teat or by tube.
Looking then to some other elements of management of calves at a young age, and disbudding being one of them. What is the ideal timing of disbudding of calves?
So, relatively early is where we start. So what do I mean by relatively early? Preferably younger than 4 weeks and preferably younger than 2 weeks of age. Now, sometimes in smaller calves in particular, they may not, the horn may not have grown enough to disbud them within 2 weeks. We're running a series of calf care events. We'll come on to that later on, but in that series of calf care events, we'll have veterinary speakers talking about the use of anesthetic and analgesics. We know that a calf older than 2 weeks of age, by law, it needs an anesthetic for the dehorning of those calves. And the research would show that any calf that receives an anesthetic and an analgesic at the time of disbudding, those calves recover much more quickly from the disbudding process. Less than 2 weeks of age, it's not mandatory to administer an anesthetic. Between 2 and 4 weeks of age, the farmer can administer the anesthetic himself. Above 4 weeks of age, by law, a veterinary surgeon is required to administer the anesthetic. So do it early and do it thoroughly is what our recommendation is. Use anesthetics and use analgesics as well to prevent the inflammation after and can give a longer term pain relief to the calf.
And while it isn't necessarily by law something that you must do at less than 2 weeks of age, but is that recommended also?
It's considered best practice at this stage by veterinary practitioners, because it speeds up the kind of the recovery and resumption of normal functioning of the calf if it's correctly anesthetized, irrespective of the age at which it's dehorned.
And talk through the procedure to administer the anaesthetic.
So the anaesthetic is administered at a point halfway between the base of the ear and the corner of the eye. There's a little bony ridge there called the frontal bone, and a 5/8 inch needle is inserted up to its hub at that point. And as it's being withdrawn, the last little bit of anaesthetic is administered to create a kind of a localized anesthetic in the skin area as well. So you're trying to get the nerves there to numb them and take the pain away from it. And that's how it's administered, Emma-Louise. So it's a detailed process. Again, it'll be covered, and there are diagrams in the booklet that we're producing for the calf care events that will illustrate how best to do it, and it'll be described thoroughly on the day by the vets who are speaking on that subject.
And also, I guess, the local vet will be available to give recommendations and provide the appropriate products.
Correct. More than willing, I'm sure.
For calf disbudding.
Correct.
Another thing, George, to look at, we'd be familiar with bloat in cows, but
Correct.
In the spring of 2021, there were many complaints or, comments from farmers of incidents of bloat in young calves. What is the perfect storm for bloat to arise in those young calves?
Okay, I run a lot of online discussion group meetings with farmer groups and their advisors in the spring gone by. And I'm amazed at the number of farmers that talked about observing bloating and losing calves in the spring with bloat. It's amazing. I suppose it's quite different to, say, like bloat in cows caused by clover or whatever the story is. It's a different sort of bloat. It's a bloat typically, not always, but typically of the abomasum. which is the main stomach that's used in the calf's early life. It's not the rumen, it's the abomasum, it's the true stomach, it's where bloat tends to build up. And typical scenarios where it occurs will be in situations where there's an excessive quantity of a readily fermentable carbohydrate, typically kind of milky, sugary type products going into the calf. It'll occur in situations where there's a delay in the emptying of the abomasum, so that it's sitting around for a long time. And it'll be caused in those situations where there's a bit of dirt around, maybe less than hygienic calf feeding equipment would be typical. That sort of equipment will seed the abomasum with the bacteria that cause bloat. So you have a dirty environment or a less than hygienic environment. You have things that will slow down emptying of the abomasum, and an excessive amount of a fermentable carbohydrate type substance in the rumen. Typically, things like milk would be the real thing that will cause that. Large volumes of cold milk will do it now, no problem at all.
And clinical signs, George, that farmers should be aware of is if this is a problem that's about to present itself this spring.
Well, I'll tell you an example of a farm where it occurred on now. A farm I know pretty well. The farmer in question rang me. He'd been talking to his vet, and the vet, between the two of them, were quite perplexed about the symptoms they were seeing. Calves are going completely off milk, wouldn't drink. They were kicking their stomachs. They didn't seem to be terribly distended. In other words, they weren't bloated up terribly much. That wasn't terribly. You'd see things like teeth grinding going on, salivation. A couple of calves found dead. In that scenario, there were 120 calves born on the farm. I think 8 of them died. It was as if the whole rumen and everything, or the whole stomach and the digestive system, kind of just completely stopped, and the calf died in a day or two. And when the calves were examined, they had a kind of a build-up of a kind of curdy stuff in their stomach, and it's typical abomasal bloat was occurring in those farms. Typical. So things like you're getting that whole reduced intake, you're getting teeth grinding, salivation, the calf being very uncomfortable, signs of colic, and if there is abdominal distension, it'll be on the right hand side, typically in cases of abomasal bloat. So it's and often sudden death as well. 2 of the calves, of the 8 calves that died in that farm, died of sudden death. They're just found dead. No other symptoms at all. So really strange sort of symptoms. But eventually we narrowed it down to abomasal bloat in that particular farm.
So naturally, you talk about in the perfect storm, it can be things like, a hygiene issue with the calf feeders. So naturally, if you can keep the calf feeders and the living environment clean, that will reduce the potential risk of abomasal bloat. But you also mentioned the fermentable carbohydrates sitting in the abomasum. If you offered water, is that something that would keep the milk flowing through the abomasum and reduce the risk of bloat?
We'll just go back there to the clean bit first, or the hygiene bit first. You won't get bloat if there isn't seed, if there isn't something, a bacteria in the abomasum that'll cause bloat. You'll get bloat or abomasal bloat if there are bacteria. Bacteria, first of all, need to be present to create that bloat. They create beta toxins. They produce a gas. They can't produce it if the equipment is hygienic, because if the equipment is maintained in a very hygienic manner, well, then the bacteria won't be in a high concentration in the abomasum starting off. The second thing then has to do with the water access. We need clean, hygienic water available to them. If water is available to them, it'll allow them to regulate the osmolality, or the liquidity of the material that's in their abomasum, and they'll pass the fluids that they have in their stomach, in their abomasum, through quicker in the presence of clean water. If water is dirty or contaminated, it'll be much less of it will be consumed by the calves, and therefore you're increasing the risk of abomasal bloat occurring.
And George, you have mentioned the calf care events, and this is the time of year for it, and Teagasc, in conjunction with Animal Health Ireland and VOLAC, open up dairy farms to discuss best practice in calf rearing. What can you tell us about this year's event?
This is year 12 of our running calf care events, and typically we'll have attendances in the order of 1,500 to 2,000 people at around 12 events, and this year we're going to run 13 events. Now, they're run by Teagasc and the AHI, the Animal Health Ireland, and we're sponsored by Volac, but couldn't be run without the co-ops from all around the country. Our first event will take place on Monday the 10th of January in County Cork, in Berrings in County Cork. And our last event will take place right up in the north west of the country on Thursday the 27th of January in Killygordon in County Donegal. So they'll be run right around the country. There'll be plenty of advertising done over the next couple of weeks. And the 4 key topics that will take place will be around calf housing, around colostrum quality, around bloating calves, and pain management. So looking forward to those events. When I look back over the years, Emma-Louise, what I can see is in the early years, we focused an awful lot on, keeping calves alive. So we were back to the 1, 2, 3 of colostrum. Now, what's happened over the years is we've seen a gradual increase in or a gradual reduction in mortality in calves, to the extent now that a recent study from Holland showed that a significant decline in mortality or an improvement in health status of calves that were purchased into veal units in February and March. And what they discovered was that those calves were actually, the calves taken in February and March are actually coming from Ireland. So the Irish calves have a higher health status than nearly anywhere in Europe, which is a reflection of the good work being done by farmers over the last decade or so, and our ability as farmers to take on the messages around best practice that are coming through, and hats off to the farmers of the country for doing so. I suppose where the events have moved over those years, Emma-Louise, is there's a greater awareness of the importance of things like, high standards of animal welfare and pain relief and calf management. They've all crept in to our topics over the years, and with the interest that's there, you can see there's huge support and huge good intent by people to rear calves better. And look, it's a hugely important topic and issue for Irish dairy farmers. And the reason for that, I suppose, is because we're dependent on the sale of about a third of the beef calves born on Irish farms. These are the surplus, these are the bull calves, Frisian bull calves or dairy bull calves, and beef breed calves. There's about little over 1 million calves born that are not dairy heifers on farms each year. About a third of them are retained on the farm of origin and reared there. Sometimes they're brought through to finish, and more times they're sold as stores or weanlings. About a third are sold to other farmers, but a third of them are also exported off farm. And it's hugely important that for all 3 categories, a high standard of management, of animal welfare and health is maintained in ensuring the calves have a healthy and trouble-free life. And it starts with their birth.
I think that's a great note to finish on, Georgia. And the statistics you talk about, the reduction in calf mortality, it can't be overemphasized, and it is something that we would have spoken previously to Padraig French about. The trend is downward in terms of mortality on dairy farms, and it's demonstrating the huge amount of work that is being done by dairy farmers in taking care of their animals. And at this time of year, they tend to take more care of their animals than they do themselves, and hugely commendable. We look forward to the calf care events across the country in the coming weeks. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to George Ramsbottom for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.